Now, there are some philosophers who claim that what makes us human is that we care about things. We are concerned with or interested in the world. And when I speak to some of my students about what scholarship entails, I often say that it is about taking an interest in something as an act of love. And no act of love happens if you don't care about things. When we allow ourselves to let our cares and concerns be laid bare, when we are clear about our assumptions and why those assumptions matter for how and why we take an interest in the world, we're doing something called value-based inquiry. Now, there are many names for this kind of investigation, but one of the most common ways of describing value-based inquiry is to frame it within the context of faith and learning. In this video, I am drawing a great deal from a book called Joining the Mission by Susan Van Zanten. Much of this discussion about the relationship between faith and knowledge, or between facts and values, is framed within the context of a famous quote by the early church father Tertullian. Now, Tertullian was initially a Stoic philosopher, but upon converting to Christianity, he found that academic learning was something he was deeply suspicious about. Thus his famous question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? The short answer for Tertullian was nothing. But he was far from the only person to attempt to answer that question. Indeed, how faith or values interact with learning has been a central question for Western education since Tertullian posed it in late antiquity. Now you might be asking, what do we mean by faith and knowledge? And why do we even frame the question that way? These are good questions to ask. And in this video, I'll be going through some of these main theories about how faith and learning, or values and learning, intersect. But for now, let's talk briefly about how the idea of modernity set up a separation between facts and values, faith and knowledge, and how that paradigm shapes what we do now. The European Enlightenment and the birth of modernity gave us many things, but one of the big things it gave us was a distinction between facts and values. Facts are truths which we arrive at through disinterested research. We bracket our biases and interests in the name of rigorous research, and then we arrive at truth. We can have our values and opinions and our beliefs in private, but in the public light of quality research, we must be entirely valueless. Facts in this interpretation are objective and value neutral, and they are chief among the things that can be known. But what if the facts and the ways we arrive at those facts are not all that value neutral? What if, in fact, there is a near impossibility of doing anything that is valueless? How do we negotiate these things? Van Zanten lays out a few different approaches to the relation between faith and value on the one hand and reason and knowledge on the other. So let's walk through some of these. Now, the first approach is called reconstructionism, and this is where you divide faith and learning into distinct categories. Adherents to this approach tend to think that we must jettison most, if not all, of the academic enterprise in favor of what we might call a Christian approach based on the truths of the Bible. So the hypothesis for this reconstructionist approach is that non-Christian academic approaches are based on inadequate foundational beliefs, and thus are epistemologically suspect. And what does that mean? Well, what it means is that what we need are Christian disciplines, like Christian psychology, based on a biblical model of personhood to employ as a guide for counseling. Practitioners of this reconstruction approach would have to essentially construct their disciplines from scratch, keeping them from falling into too much similarity with secular ways of knowing and researching. Now, there's a kind of sister version of this that's called the two realms approach. And this approach concedes that certain academic disciplines are focused entirely on, quote, objectively imparting cognitive knowledge and professional skills, while there are other areas like student development or campus ministry staff, or maybe your Bible classes that require you to foster your spirituality. The two realms approach claims to value both academic rigor and spirituality, but it sees them as fundamentally different areas. Thus, even though some people might take a Bible class, the content covered in most of their courses and the presentation of that material might not be affected by faith. In other words, you might take a biology class and never hear Jesus or Allah or Moses mentioned once, but you take a Bible class or a spirituality class and that's supposed to fulfill it. This is what this approach attempts to do. Van Zanten lays out a third approach, which she calls the value-added approach, and this one expects adherents to address the more subjective issues stemming from faith and character within their fields. So professors and students alike are responsible for raising questions of values and ethics. Van Zanten claims that, quote, Thomas Aquinas, the first great advocate of this view, held that natural law, which was perceivable by human reason, establishes the structures of the state and promotes the cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, which are completed for the Christian with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And those are bestowed only through divine grace. Faith leads people to salvation, while learning promotes humanity's temporal well-being, end quote. Van Zanten adds that the value-added approach consigns questions of meaning and morality to religious ways of knowing that are distinct from academic disciplines, but nonetheless insists that these are significant issues to be addressed. In this approach, for example, mathematical calculations in and of themselves are neutral tools, but such calculations can be employed for good or ill, to encourage a way of life or a way of death. The value-added approach would say that engineering, for example, is completely and utterly neutral in terms of value when it comes to, building things. But a practitioner of the field of engineering can decide whether or not they want to work on engineering things like bombs, or they want to work on engineering things like hospitals, right? That's where this value-added approach comes in, that all practitioners have to add their values to their discipline or to their field, which might itself be perceivably value neutral. All three of these approaches, the Reconstructionist, the two realms, and the value-added approach, maintain some kind of separation between faith and knowledge and value, and they value both sides of the equation differently. In contrast to separation, the rest of our paradigms will explicitly attempt to find ways to alleviate or eliminate any separation between faith and knowing. The first main one is called integration, and this approach follows a simple mantra: all truth is God's truth. According to philosopher Arthur Holmes, integration is concerned with the positive contributions of human learning to an understanding of the faith and the development of a Christian worldview, and with a positive contribution of the Christian faith to all the arts and sciences. Now let's unpack this definition a little bit. Integration focuses on how human learning can deepen what we value. Integration is also interested in developing a value-based view of the world and the way that our values can contribute to all disciplines and ways of knowing. Hopefully, you can see that there's a significant difference between the integrational approach and the previous three we've discussed. Now, Holmes notes that, quote, our deepest beliefs inform the questions we ask, the evidence that we count, and the answers we eventually reach. If we consider the questions we ask, the evidence we count, and the answers we reach alongside the ways we engage with others and other areas of living, then what we're considering is called a worldview. A worldview is holistic. It sees things not just as separate segmented parts, but also as a whole. It's a systematic understanding of life, and no academic discipline is exempted from contact with it. If you think about worldviews as foundational for knowing and living, it is essentially claiming that you can't merely have an intellectual understanding of a subject area when you study it or when you practice it, that you bring your whole person to it, even as you're trying to, maintain some kind of objectivity. Then you're concerned with the cognitive, intellectual, propositional nature of one's perspective on life. You're concerned with a worldview. A Christian worldview, for example, locates reason within the bounds of faith and articulates what scholar Carl Henry would call a, quote, theistic system exhibiting the rational coherence of biblical revelation. In other words, what you're doing is you would be examining the world, bearing in mind that the things that you value and think are important are shaped by your faith, and that encounter is not value neutral. That encounter is, in fact, value laden. In its best forms, worldview education identifies the ways that human beings operate with a set of often unquestioned and unrecognized philosophical premises, what philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer would call the good kind of prejudice, the things we care about. And it demonstrates that every position, even those that claim to be extremely religiously and value neutral, in fact rely on certain kinds of assumptions. In other words, to claim to be value neutral is to have a particular value you are espousing. But what happens when worldviews are maybe not so good? Worldviews are not the be-all and end-all of value-based inquiry. As Van Zanten notes, in its more limited forms, foundational worldview education provides answers but does not leave room for a lot of questions. It assumes that there is an easily identifiable and uniformly agreed upon Christian worldview, and it also may succumb to a kind of triumphalism arising from dualism, drawing clear lines between a Christian worldview and other worldviews, with the assumption that the Christian worldview, as we articulate it, is always more faithful to truth. What counts as a worldview and what doesn't can be murky. Is there really a difference between the Enlightenment worldview and the Romantic worldview? And what about rhetoric and ideology? What about people who use the language of one worldview but do so only for the sake of getting one over on you or convincing you that they're on your team when really they think quite differently? Every method, every discipline, every area of study has its limitations, just as it has its strengths. And likewise, all of us have biases and prejudices and things that we care about, and those things find their way into our research. Value-based inquiry isn't something we should run from in the name of getting to the so-called objective truth. Instead, value-based inquiry allows us to lay our assumptions on the table and make clear why we do what we do and why we interpret the way that we do. This type of inquiry doesn't begin simply with the question, what is this thing? But why do you think this thing matters? And moves on from there. As you work on your projects, as you work on your individual assignments, think about the ways in which you bring certain assumptions, whether they are assumptions generated from your life experiences, assumptions generated from your discipline that you study, assumptions generated from your religious or ethical commitments. And think about the ways that those play into the work that you're doing in this class, and also going on into the future and your future careers and future vocations and things like that.